Hi everyone, my name is Audrey Kenneschnecht and this video is for Ball State University's SPCE 683, Assignment 6, Parent Training. Today we are going to be doing a parent training talking about the 4 functions of behavior, replacement behaviors, punishment, and extinction. So I put together a little PowerPoint for you all to follow through with me as I talk. So there are 4 functions of behavior. When we think about behavior and why behavior occurs, there's always a reason as to why it's occurring. So behaviors are learned and maintained through the interactions that they have with the environment. And these interactions are either positive or negatively reinforced contingencies. And they can be strengthened by either getting something or getting out of something. So as behavior analysts, working with your children, our goal is to identify the function of those challenging behaviors so that we can implement an intervention to help decrease those behaviors and increase positive behaviors. So the 4 functions of behavior are attention, access, automatic, and escape. The first function is attention. So problem behavior often results in immediate attention from others. That attention might look like head turns, reprimands, attempts to soothe the child, or give surprised facial expressions. For example, when little Johnny hits his brother and you see them, you might be like, "Oh no, Johnny, don't hit your brother." Little do you know that attention that you provided to Johnny when he hit his brother might maintain the behavior and then increase that behavior to occur again in the future. And so here we have the problem behavior is maintained by the positive reinforcement from others in the form of those reactions. The next function is access or tangible. So problem behavior often results in access to reinforcing materials or other stimuli. This might look like giving the child access to their iPad, giving them their toy that they're crying for, giving them the candy that they want, because providing access to that item or activity might temporarily stop the problem behavior. So if little Johnny is crying because he wants his iPad, and even though you told him no, you might just end up giving in and giving him access to the iPad, because then he will at least stop crying for a little bit. But here we have providing access actually inadvertently makes the problem behavior more probable in the future, because what happens is now little Johnny knows that next time I want something, all I have to do is cry and have a fit, and then she's going to give in and give me what I want. So that is if the function is maintained by access to something. The next function is automatic. So sometimes behaviors don't depend on the action of others to provide an outcome. Some behaviors actually produce their own reinforcement in and of themselves. So this might look like a child hand flapping. It might look like mouthing inedible objects because they like the feeling of the different textures in their mouth, or it might look like them rocking back and forth. So these behaviors occur even when the individual is alone and it's independent of the social reinforcement that it might receive from others. So a behavior is assumed to be maintained by automatic reinforcement only after those social reinforcers have been ruled out. So an example of this might be a child who mouths inedible objects like dirt, sticks, figurines. They might mouth, and then even if the parent then reprimands them for mouthing, that would be if it were to be maintained by attention, even if they are mouthing inedible objects when they're alone, that's how you would assume that the behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement, because it's happening independent of the behavior and the reinforcement that they would be receiving from others. So automatic reinforcement is when the behavior alone produces reinforcement. The next and last function of behavior is escape. So problem behaviors often result in termination or postponement of aversive effects. So this might look like getting out of work, getting out of doing a chore, or getting out of class. So a child might have a tantrum when their therapist tells them it's time to transition from play to work. They might drop to the floor and start crying to prolong the task of actually getting to work. So them being successful in getting out of work reinforces that behavior, and it's more likely to occur in the future when it's time to do work, when they're presented with a demand to do a chore, or if it's like a non-preferred subject in school, they might have behaviors so that the teacher will send them out of class because they're being too disruptive. So little do the teachers know, they're actually reinforcing that behavior because it's allowing them to escape from what it is that they don't want to do anyways. So the problem behaviors can be strengthened by the negative reinforcement and the extent to which they're able to successfully escape, avoid, and or terminate the difficult tasks or unpleasant activities. So those are our 4 functions of behavior. How to identify the function. I talked about this a little bit, but when we are trying to identify the function, we're looking at what is happening immediately before the behavior occurs and immediately after the behavior occurs. So we call this a 3-term contingency, or we look at it like A, B, C. The antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. So an example, when you're looking at a child who has a tantrum to escape from work, what happens immediately before the behavior? The therapist tells the child, Johnny, it's time to go to work. So that's the antecedent that then causes the behavior, which is Johnny having a tantrum. And then the consequence is that the time to get to work is delayed because he's successfully escaping by having the problem behavior. So what do? We've identified the function. We want to decrease the behaviors. From here, we look at replacement behaviors. So we want to identify a replacement behavior that serves the same function of the problem behavior. Replacement behaviors teach the individual an alternative, more appropriate way to get their wants and needs met. So in the example that we were just talking about, little Johnny getting upset when it's time to go to work, a replacement behavior would look like Johnny asking his therapist for a break. Or it might look like Johnny asking his therapist for 1 more minute of playtime so that he can, prepare better for the transition. Replacement behaviors are important to serve the same function so that they're successfully getting their wants and needs met in a more appropriate alternative way. So I gave a few examples according to each function. So if a child engages in a tantrum behavior to escape from work, the replacement behavior might be to teach the child how to request for a break, because that way they're able to escape and take a break from the task and prolong it, but in an appropriate way. If a child is engaging in yelling out behavior to receive attention from his teacher, a replacement behavior would be to teach the child to raise their hand to be called on to then get the attention from their teacher. A child engages in tantrum behavior to receive access to their iPad. A replacement behavior would be to teach the child how to ask for the iPad appropriately. So teaching them how to say, I want the iPad, or can I have the iPad? Or if the child's nonverbal, teaching them how to request for an iPad using PACS. Or the last one would be a child engages in mouthing inedible objects for automatic reinforcement. So a replacement behavior would be to provide the child with a chew toy, because that chew toy is going to give them the same sensory input that they're seeking by mouthing all the edible objects. So that would all be replacement behavior examples that would serve the same function as the problem behavior. So moving on to punishment. So when a response is followed immediately by a stimulus change that then decreases the future frequency of similar responses. So there's positive punishment, which is when a stimulus is added to then decrease the problem behavior, or there's negative punishment, which is when a stimulus is removed to then decrease the behavior. Now, we always focus on using reinforcement over punishment. Punishment is always our last resort in applied behavior analysis. We want to rule out all the positive reinforcement techniques that we can use first before using punishment, because punishment is a little bit more intense than reinforcement. So we always start with reinforcement techniques first, and then punishment is a last resort if the problem behavior is not decreasing using punishment or using reinforcement. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is extinction. So extinction occurs when previously reinforced behavior is completely discontinued. So as a result, the behavior is no longer being reinforced, and this causes a decrease of that behavior occurring in the future. Extinction provides zero possibility of reinforcement. So when we are looking at a behavior like a tantrum for attention, if we are putting that behavior on extinction, when the child's crying, we are planned ignoring. We are not providing any attention to the tantrum behavior. We want to make sure that the child is safe in an area that they're safe and they're not going to be hurt, but we're not going to be providing any attention to the tantrum, to the negative behaviors. That's putting it on extinction. When the child realizes that, oh, my tantrums aren't getting the attention from mom that I want, then those behaviors are going to decrease. And when we're using replacement behaviors, such as teaching the child to then come to mom and tap her on the shoulder to get her attention, because that's a more appropriate alternative way to get attention, then we heavily reinforce that appropriate alternative way to get attention. So extinction completely stops reinforcing the problem behavior, and that in turn decreases the problem behavior. So using reinforcement and replacement behaviors are so important, and knowing the function of the behavior is so important so that we can appropriately respond to them and appropriately put interventions into place so that we can best help the child get their wants and needs met. So I hope that was helpful, and thanks for listening.